Good morning. Welcome to Desert Palm UCC. We're glad you're all here this morning. And welcome to folks who are watching from home. I wanted to begin by thanking everybody who helped out yesterday with the service we had for Audrey Penner, longtime, dearly beloved member of the church, and we had a wonderful service for her yesterday. So, and many, many hands, too many people to mention, but lots of involvement. The uke group playing, and it was really meaningful. So I just wanted to thank everybody and acknowledge that. A couple quick announcements. We're going to have confirmation right after church today. So meet me in one of the back classrooms, Liam and my kids, and any other confirmands we have. And I just wanted to, for folks who are visiting, or just as a reminder to us all, we're doing a summer sermon series on banned books. You know, we're obviously living in very strange political, historical, spiritual, religious times. All kinds of, every day it seems like there's something new and unprecedented, whether it's, the global temperature or, threats to democracy. And as many of you know, there's been some articles recently in the press. There's efforts to, block people from learning about racism. We can't talk about critical race theory. And there's a renewed vigor around banning books. So I thought, well, let's look at some of those banned books and see what they might have to teach us. And so today our book that we're going to be exploring is Lord of the Flies. I don't know if if it's probably been a while. If you've read it, you probably read it in high school. That's when we read all the important books, when we're way too young to understand what we're reading. Although, who knows, maybe our high schoolers are smarter than we are, probably. But it's a book that plunges us into the problem of violence. I'll be saying a word or two about the nature of the book in case you haven't read it or forgotten what it's about. But I think most of us recall that it's essentially about a group of boys who are stuck on a desert island, and they have to figure everything out for themselves, and things get quite violent. So that's the book we're going to be exploring. We'll be seeing what our religious tradition has to say, and how we can take the wisdom from that masterpiece of creative fiction and relate it to the times in which we're living. So that's what we're going to be up to today. So now let's rise in body or spirit for our call to worship. Ellen will be leading us.
Come join the fellowship of God's people who gather as faithful disciples of Christ. We seek the one who frees us from uncertainty and doubt. Come, join the welcome of God's people who meet together for justice and peace. We seek the one who is trustworthy, the one who gives us what is good. Come, join the celebration of God's people of the one who was and is and shall ever be.
We raise our voices in praise and honor to God and worship the one who is faithful. Will you all join me in singing hymn number 438, When Peace Like a River?
Our first reading is from Amos, chapter 5, verses 8 to 24. Alas for you who desire the day of God. Why do you want the day of God? It is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is the word of God.
Let's go ahead and rise in body and spirit again, and let's sing Arousing This Little Light of Mine as we let our youth and children go to Sunday school.
Our gospel reading today is from John, chapter 8, verses 1 to 11. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. The word of God.
Thank you, Ellen. So as I said, today we're continuing our summer series looking at banned books, and today's book is The Lord of the Flies. by William Golding. If it's been a while since you've read it, or maybe you never got around to reading it, I started to wonder, did I ever actually read this book? I've thought about it a lot, and I finally did read it in preparation for this. But in case it's been a while, the general plot, again, a group of English boys, this is during World War II, they're flying over the Pacific, their plane gets shot down, and the plane crash lands in an island. They're in this jungle forest situation, stranded without any adults, and they gradually grow more and more wild until the end when they're rescued by the adults. And as I said, there's some violence, which is one of the reasons the book has been banned, or people have tried to ban it over time. So the novel really plunges us into the problem of violence, something that's getting a lot of attention as of late because violence is erupting everywhere, it seems. So this morning I really want to try to wrestle with this a bit in a very serious way in relation to our faith tradition, this moment in history, and really drawing on the power of the gospel revelation. I think as people of faith, it is incumbent upon us every now and then to get serious and say, what does our tradition have to say about what's happening in the world? I'm also going to draw today from another book I happened to stumble upon by Dr. Edith Eger, a psychotherapist in the San Diego area, who's also a Holocaust survivor. As soon as I saw that she was from San Diego and teaching there, I said to Ellen, hey, do you know this psychologist? Oh, yeah, of course. If you don't know, Ellen and Jim know everyone in the psychological community in the Southern California area. And so sure enough, they know Edith Eger, which blows my mind because she's just such a brilliant, compassionate, amazing person, which I say just from having read the book. Her book is called The Choice. And again, we're talking about violence. And this is interesting. The person who writes the introduction to Dr. Eger's book is Philip Zimbardo. So if that name's ringing a bell, I see some nodding heads. That's the psychologist who made famous by the Stanford prison experiment, where they took a bunch of undergraduates, they randomly said, okay, you guys are the guards, you guys are the prisoners, here's our mock jail, and let's see what happens. And as you all no doubt know, the guards became brutal. And at one point they had to stop the experiment. I always thought it was an interesting detail that it's when Zimbardo's then girlfriend, later wife, came in to where the experiment was being conducted, and she saw on the monitor what was happening, and she said to him, you have to stop this. And so they did. So that's who writes the foreword, the introduction to Edith Eger's book about being a Holocaust survivor and then becoming a psychologist and helping other people deal with trauma. She begins her remarkable book, The Choice, again, that's the title of it, The Choice, Embrace the Possible. This book about healing and resilience, she begins it with a story of her treatment of an army captain whose wife was having an affair. Remember our gospel story we just heard? The mob wants to crucify this woman caught in adultery, right? When the captain discovered what was going on, his world threatened to collapse on him, and he became fixated on what he felt was his only course of action, killing his wife. Take a minute to feel the anguish and the weight of 5,000 years of patriarchal power combined with military training to kill. After having arrived in her office, he goes to see Dr. Eger prior to thinking he was going to go kill his wife. But a friend said, hey, you should go see this psychologist. She's really good dealing with trauma, and you're going through a hard time. So he went to her office. As a Holocaust survivor, she was highly attuned to the physical threats and danger in her environment. For the rest of her life, she will be, right? Immediately, when this army captain came into the room, she calls him Jason, she felt danger and threat. She just sensed it in her bones. It wasn't until later that she realized he had a loaded gun on him, concealed on him. He came into the office, he sat down, he was silent. He was just rigid, sitting there in her office. She's a psychologist. She wants to engage him like, why are you here? How are things going? Tell me about your life. But all of a sudden the room was just filled with tension. And he was just silent like a stone. But one of the things that makes her such an amazing therapist is she has these incredible instincts that come through time and time again. She stands up, she says, Captain, we're going for a walk. That's an order. And he said, yes, ma'am. And he got up and they went for a walk. The crisis wasn't over, and we're going to return to that. But that's what happened in that moment. She describes how a look of panic first flashed across his face because he was surrendering control to her. She had come close to death several times before. I highly recommend her book, The Choice. It is unbelievable what she went through. Because of her personal bravery and courage and her insights as a psychologist, her book offers us sort of a glass-bottom boat view of the nature of violence in the world. I want to invoke another powerful way of thinking about violence that's rooted in our biblical tradition, too, today. And that is the work of René Girard, the historian of religion. I've talked about him before. He has made famous this model of scapegoating, which has launched a movement within Christian theology. He wrote several books. I don't think he's still alive, but many Girardian scholars continue his work, and I am deeply indebted to his understanding of the Gospels. He offers a powerful theological lens for understanding violence based on the very simple observation that groups strengthen themselves through the dynamic of scapegoating. Girard's life work was to highlight and illuminate how this is really the key to understanding the biblical revelation. So that's a bold claim, but I stand by that. Think about it, the very term scapegoating that we use all the time to explain what we see happening in the world is rooted in the Bible, right? That's a story in the Bible. Over and over again, we see how, within the biblical revelation, we see how individuals pay the price for the group as the scapegoating dynamic gets revved up. Think of Joseph, thrown into the pit by his brothers, right? The one victim, the innocent victim, paying the price. Or Jonah, remember what happens when that storm kicks up? What do? They cast lots. What do they do to the Jonah? They throw him overboard, and the storm calmed. Right there in our biblical revelation. Think of Job. What happens to Job? He's done nothing wrong. His friends gang up on him. You must have done something wrong, man. Look what's happening to you, right? Or the persecution of the prophets. And then it all culminates in the gospel with the crowd screaming, "Crucify him." I mean, if we cannot connect these dots and understand that this is what the Bible is about, then we are lost in the quest to understand violence. We are told the story of Jesus' crucifixion 4 different times from 4 different perspectives. And then what comes next in the biblical revelation? The story of Saul. What is he doing? He's persecuting the other. He's going house to house, hunting Christians until he encounters Jesus. And then he goes through radical transformation. He stops persecuting those out there and starts dealing with what's in here. It's also clear when you stop and think about it that what's astonishing is the secular fragility that hides from these truths by claiming, oh, religion's got nothing to say to us about the real world, right? Right? What could all those things have to do with, oh, slavery or lynching? The death machine of capital punishment, which is revving up right here in Arizona. We are selecting people. We are saying, you're next. We're going to kill you tomorrow at sunrise, right? Girard calls this the single victim mechanism. These kinds of things can help us understand not just history, not things like slavery and lynching, but what is happening right now in the world, all around us. I don't know if you guys heard the story of Michael Cox. He's an African-American policeman who years ago was a detective working in the Boston police force. He was dressed, not in uniform. He was an undercover detective. He responds to this law enforcement action, and some white officers mistook him for a criminal because he was black, no doubt, and they jumped on him and beat him. And then when they realized he was a police officer, they left him lying in the road. If it wasn't for the fact that Michael Cox, this man, stayed in the police department and has recently been made chief of the Boston Police Department, this story would have been lost amongst 1,000 other stories of black people beaten by white men. I'll put a link to that story in the sermon. Now, how do we understand that? How do we understand these white cops beating up this black cop, right? Well, we could bring a sociological lens or a psychological lens. They were projecting their evil onto him. We could certainly bring a critical race theory if we hurry before it's illegal to talk about critical race theory, right? But what might a religious exploration of this beating of a victim tell us? We don't recognize that we have a very powerful means of understanding the violence going on in the world. And according to Girard, that is the scapegoating dynamic. But we're not alone in our reluctance to go there and understand these things. Groups and institutions are reluctant to confront the reality of the scapegoating dynamic because it's so deeply rooted in everything we do. As Jesus understood 2,000 years ago, it is so much easier to focus on the speck of dust in the eye of our neighbor than it is to deal with what is inside us. Think about that crowd that wanted to kill the woman. In our gospel reading, it's like, Tom, why the obsession with violence? Well, let's think about the Bible. Let's think about what we are supposed to know and understand and teach and preach. They were trying to trick Jesus. They brought this woman to him and said, hey, according to the law, she's supposed to be killed. What should we do, Jesus? Trying to trick him, right? If he says, well, show mercy, then, oh, you're not following the law. But if he says kill her, then they know they're forcing him to go against what he really believes. But what does he do? You can tell me what he does. Before he says anything, what does he do? Yeah, he looks down and he starts drawing in the sand. Very mysterious detail. Thomas More devotes a whole book called Writing in the Sand. Girard says that Jesus looked away from the crowd because when the crowd wants to kill somebody, when you look at them, that feeds the dynamic. They are projecting onto you the things that they need to project onto you. And that is part of the dynamic. So when Jesus looked down, he broke the dynamic. And he just said, according to the story, hey, whoever's perfect, go ahead and throw that first rock. And he waited. And the text says that one by one, people left the mob, beginning with the oldest people there, because presumably they were the wisest, and they were the first to understand the point of Jesus' words. It is so easy to project our fears, our struggles anywhere out there, and then send the drones, send the bombs, send the troops. Or if it's in our family, send the mean words, because we're caught up in that scapegoating dynamic. I want to go back to the story of Jason, the army captain. And remember I said it, when she broke the tension, Dr. Egger did by saying, Captain, get up, we're going for a walk. He said, yes, ma'am. He got up, they went for a walk. But then they came back into her office in a very serious life or death situation manifested. That energy came back. His hostility towards his wife, his deep sense of pain, all roared up in that moment. Remember, it's their very first session together. He says he's going to go kill his wife. And I just want to say, I recognize you guys that right now, we're living in very strange times. There's, a mass shooting every day, several mass shootings every day. We cannot control, gun violence. And so I realize it's kind of a traumatic thing to be talking about, but we're talking about violence, and we have a problem with violence, and there's a powerful positive ending here. So stay with me. She says to him, they're standing there in her office. He's got the gun in his hand. She says, what will happen if you kill your wife? I don't care, he says. She says, this is a long quote from her perspective. He was pointing the gun at me, right at my chest, gripping it with both hands, his finger frozen near the trigger. Was I a target? Could he take his rage out on me, pull the trigger by mistake, and send a bullet flying? There wasn't time to be afraid. I just admire her so much. Her instincts, her willingness. At one point, she gives a talk to some military army chaplains in a hotel near the Wolf Den that was Hitler's bunker. That's where she met these army chaplains. She's just fearless, this woman. She says to him, she says, there wasn't time to be afraid. Then she says to him, do you have children? I was acting on instinct, she says. Don't mention my children, Jason hissed. He lowered the gun a fraction. If he pulled the trigger now, he would shoot my arm, my chair, not my heart. Do you love your children? I asked. Anger, however consuming, is never the most important emotion. It is only the outer edge, the thinly exposed top layer of a much deeper feeling. She knew this as a psychologist, and the feeling disguised by the mask of anger is usually fear. And you can't feel love and fear at the same time. If I could appeal to Jason's heart, if I could get him to feel love, even for a second, it might be long enough to interrupt the signal of fear that was about to become violence. Already his fury was on pause. Do you love your children? I asked again. Jason wouldn't answer. It was as though he was stuck in the crosshairs of his own competing feelings. I have 3 kids, she says, 2 daughters, 1 son. What about you? Both, he said. Oh, a daughter and a son? He nodded. Tell me about your son. Again, her instincts. Tell me about your son. His eyes were no longer focused on me or the gun. His vision was someplace else. Just like when Jesus broke the visual contact of that moment of scapegoating violence, his vision was someplace else. Do you want your son to be like you? I asked. No, he said. God, no. Why not? He shook his head. He wasn't willing to go where I was leading him. What do you want? I said quietly. It's a question that can be terrifying to answer, a question that can change your life. What do you really want? I can't take this. I don't want to feel like this. You want to be free from pain. I want that bitch to pay. I'm not going to let her make a fool of me. He raised the gun. She says to him, you'll get your life back in control. Damn right I will. She says, I was sweating now. It was up to me to help him drop the gun. There was no script to follow. She did you wrong. Not anymore. It ends now. You'll protect yourself. That's right. You'll show your son how to handle things, how to be a man. I'll show him how to not let other people hurt him by killing his mom. That's what she said to him in that moment, with him standing there with a gun in his hand. What a brave woman. She writes, Jason froze. I said to him, if you kill his mother, won't you be hurting your son? Jason stared at the gun in his hand. In visits to come, he would tell me what filled his mind in that moment. He would tell me about his father, a violent man who beat into Jason, sometimes with words, sometimes with his fists, that this is what a man does. A man is invulnerable. A man doesn't cry. A man is in control. A man calls the shots. He would tell me that he had always intended to be a better father than his father had been, but he didn't know how. He didn't know how to teach and guide his children without intimidation. And then she says this, Dr. Egger, when I asked him to consider how his choice to seek revenge would affect his son, he was suddenly compelled to search for a possibility that up until then he hadn't been able to summon. That there might be a way to live that didn't perpetuate violence and insecurity, that would bring him and his son not to the imprisoning seduction of revenge, but to the wide open sky of promise, healing, and potential. Breaking the cycle of violence. What Jesus did 2,000 years ago, and what he calls us to do now. The power of the gospel is the power to liberate ourselves from the gravitational pull of scapegoating violence. Whether it's the call of the mob on January 6th to kill Pence, or a bunch of white policemen jumping on a black man. To break free from these deep cultural forces, we cannot simply blame those bad guys over there. We have to begin to do what Jesus challenged that crowd to do that was about to kill that woman. Consider your own life. It is a profound spiritual turning that our species has yet to be able to accomplish. But we can begin that work as individuals and as a community. I want to close with this because I think it's just so mind-blowing. Dr. Egger, the woman, the Holocaust survivor, I told you about how she gave a talk where these SS officers once stayed when they were visiting Hitler. She was able to forgive Hitler, not to condone everything that happened, obviously, but she let go of her rage But she said the hardest person to forgive in the whole healing process was myself. Think of Jason, the army captain, who was on the verge of killing his wife. He's going to have some self-forgiveness to do. All of a sudden, we're confronted with Jesus' teaching on stepping away from the cycle of violence and learning to forgive from a place of love. It's a radical concept that we are just beginning to approach. May we deepen our understanding and practice of these things. Amen.
Having received the grace of God in the redemption of Christ, we live strengthened in the faith, with hearts overflowing with thankfulness from the depths of our heart. We offer to God the very best we have. May our offering be a true act of worship and thanksgiving. Before you, O God, we offer our prayers, our presence, our gifts, and our service. We lay our gifts before you in praise and thanksgiving for the many blessings. May these offerings continue the transforming work of the Spirit in and through our congregation. And now hear us as we say the prayer Jesus taught his disciples, saying, Our Mother and Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, as we forgive those against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Before we sing our Holly Holly, I just want to say, may the peace of God, which passes all understanding, be with you now and forever. Amen. Now, if you're visiting for the first time, this is a ritual we have for the closing of our service. We sing through the Holly Holly a couple of times. There's 4 verses, just repeating the words. And sometimes we'll hold hands. So if you're worried about COVID and not comfortable, you can just cross your hands in front of your chest. Or Hold hands if you like.